All right, good afternoon. This is Nathan and Michael and our project on district heating. So what is district heating? According to the International District Energy Association, district heating is an underground infrastructure asset where thermal energy is provided to multiple buildings from a central energy plant or plants. And many times, a lot of this thermal energy is actually reused through these plants. And it can be associated from um, other power plants that just absorb the thermal waste heat.
So this is a basic representation of what district heating kind of looks like. Over in the corner, the blue and yellow building, that's our combined heater power plant, or it's also known as a CHP. It burns a multitude of things to generate heat and power and send them out to the city. Heat-wise, it sends heat out to industrial buildings, residential buildings, service buildings, and then through the buildings, the heat is used, and then it's used through heat exchangers. It's then sent back out to the plant to be heated up again. All at the same time, the residual heat is then used to heat other buildings in the system. So it's a totally closed system that is always on and constantly renewing itself. So the numbers of this, by 2050, if this goes into full effect, we would be able to have 9.38 reduced gigatons of CO2 emissions. The plan does cost about $457.1 billion, but the savings heavily outweigh that at $3.54 trillion.
Yeah, and so just some numbers so you can get a look of what it's like being implemented today. Of all of the heating demand worldwide, the current district heating accounts for 0.01% of those heating needs, but it is predicted to grow to 10% in the next 30 years from the value that it shows. And then the main fuel source for these heating um, power plants that create the whole district heating is normally sourced from natural gas, but is predicted to see more strides in geothermal and solar thermal energy over time. So there are a couple barriers to entry when cities or governments are trying to implement district heating um, into their areas, and those barriers are the high upfront cost. So the 400 some billion that Michael mentioned before is, I mean, it's a problem. I mean, if you already have a built city, you would have to literally uproot the underground systems to be able to reroute where this heating is coming from, as well as the cooling. And then those systems are pretty complex. So with all of the other infrastructure that is already built underground, adding this is just one more piece underground, and it could serve to be really complicated in some situations. And then it is generally a newly applied technology. It is not, I mean, 0.01% of the world's heating demand is using it so far. And so there are not very many systems to look at and get a good idea of how it would be implemented in other areas across the world other than Northern Europe, like Sweden um, and areas around there.
Now we move on to Sweden because Sweden is basically the shining example of how district heating works. This is their newest CHP district heating plant in Gotland. It opened just a couple of years ago, and we're going to look at Sweden as a case study just because of how well they've adopted the system. So Sweden, they were early adopters and they're continuing users of district heating. The first district heating system was introduced back in 1948 in Karlstad, Sweden. Um, Throughout the 1950s, 9 more municipalities introduced a beefed up district heating system due to the case of Karlstad, Sweden being found to be very efficient when it comes to heating metropolitan areas. Currently, all major towns and cities in Sweden have district heating systems, with 55% of the market share of heat supplied to buildings being district heating. In more rural areas, the heating systems haven't been adapted. They started using heat pumps more. But it's just because, like Nathan mentioned earlier, it's expensive to get the infrastructure out there, and it's more efficient in a compact area. And then as of 2014, 93% of multifamily dwellings are connected to district heating systems. Here's our, you can see, this is a good representation of the market share. You can see that initially fuel oil is what the primary heating was in Sweden back in the 1950s and 60s. And ever since district heating was put forth as a solution, it's been on a constant rise. You can see that it's beating out any other system that started. And like I mentioned earlier, the only system that is starting to gain more popularity is heat pumps. And again, that's just in the more rural areas of Sweden. So the neat thing about district heating is just how many ways there are to heat the water, to heat cities. So recycled heat in Sweden is 32% of the district heating sources of heat. 16% of those being coming from combined heating and power. But for recycled heat, they use industrial excess heat, flue gas, ambient heat from the heat pumps that are being used, combustion of recovered gases. This mostly takes place in ironworks, so that heat is stored and released back into the system. And then combustion of municipal and industrial waste, which Sweden is so good at, they don't have enough garbage to continue to that being a continuing source of heat for them. There's also the newer form, which is renewable heat, which comes from biomass. The biomass is tree toppings and branches that come from the local forest industry, or wood pellets that come from the manufacturing companies. And then that was 20% of the last measurement. And then we have our fossil heat, which is how it started, but is now slowly dwindling. It's only 2% is how they generate power that way, and that's coal, fuel oil, natural gases, and peat. And then a very small percentage of people still heat their homes electrically, which is about 3%. Here we have, again, a better representation of how popular the different sources of heat are for the district heating system. Again, you can see way down in 1969, it was primarily fossil CHPs and fossil boilers. And as we move further and further into the future, you can see the more renewable sources of CHP come into play with when they developed better heat recyclers and started recycling CHPs. And you can see that electricity and fossil boilers have just totally fallen by the wayside, and that they've almost completely adapted to these clean, renewable forms of CHP and district heating. Sweden, there is a few challenges that come with the future of district heating. The main challenge being lower heat demands, as houses in Sweden are built to not lose their heat as fast. So because of that, the houses don't need nearly as much to stay warm. There's also a lot of competition as to what the energy resources are going to be, just because they know the biomass can't last forever and the fossil fuels can't last forever. So it's all finding new sources for this district heating problem. Yeah, like I mentioned above, there's new heat sources, geothermal sources, and solar heating for the district heating pumps and the district heating networks. And then on the rise is the introduction of the more efficient fourth generation district heating, which doesn't lend itself to being helpful for district heating, as it makes it even more invisible than it already is. And then just revised business models of companies starting to sell district heating, because district heating is a run business. So there is propositions for companies to start taking a private interest in district heating, as there is money to be made in this endeavor.
And then so our next example was Tokyo. And so this is specifically in the Makuhari district, which is actually a new area that was built in the Tokyo area. And then the district heating is supplied by the Tokyo Gas Group. It uses natural gas powered boilers and absorption chillers to supply steam and hot and cold water. And on the top right, we can kind of see the breakdown of that, of it's starting as natural gas, starting as electricity, and then what it ends up as in the consumers' homes, as well as the businesses. And then these systems generate electricity and recover exhaust as a byproduct. So a lot of that reusable CHP. And then the recent upgrades were made to convert the district heating and cooling center to a regional energy center that provides the whole city and area with AC and heating services. Um, these upgrades further reduced the CO2 emissions by 19%, but before that, it had already cut the CO2 emissions of the area by 50%, according to Drawdown. So now they're sitting at 69% reduced CO2 emissions um, after all of the upgrades and the full implementation of the regional center. And so now we're on to our discussion questions. So some of the questions that we posed, we'll start off with the first one. How can we get district heating more frequently adopted in cities?
Well, like we had mentioned earlier, district heating is many people don't know about it just because it's a very invisible system, due to all the pipes and everything being underground and in like just connected to the side of a building. Most people don't even think about how district heating works. And the CHPs are often very far away from city centers, so it's not even a site like an afterthought as to where all the water comes from. And due to the lack of visibility, it's not a popular option. Not not because it's expensive, but because people don't know about it.
Yeah, and then
So,
at the same time, like people already have cooling and heating systems in their homes, um, like I do here, and I don't really think about that as often. And so this solution doesn't really strike as like a top of mind solution to reducing CO2 emissions. And so what we would say on how we could get it more frequently adopted, um, it was highly advised through the Drawdown article that you have to get your governments involved. Reason being is because um, the cities are overall ran by the government, and you'd have to uproot everything underneath the buildings and infrastructure to create that full system, and that would have to be led and guided by the local governments.
and then our second question was, how does district heating reduce CO2 emissions, and is it actually impactful? So, it in the beginning, you could say it in its primitive state, it wasn't helping with CO2 emissions. That wasn't on the top of people's mind when it was. But as we move farther and farther away from fossil fuels in district heating, I could see it being a very, very clean source of heating and energy for a modern city.
Yeah. Um, Tokyo, as an example, reducing their emissions by 69% after they had their upgrades all the way through. And then Sweden, a huge example by reducing the amount of fuel energy that is used, as well as electricity.
Yep. Down to just about only about 2% is used fossil fuels,
Yeah.
down from almost 100% fossil fuels in the 60s. So
Yeah. Which is also crazy when you compare it to the US too, and how much fossil fuels we still use
yeah,
for.
so it's all about finding. You have to think outside of the box to find those clean CO2 emissions.
Yeah. And then our third question, would district heating be viable in places like San Diego compared to places like Sweden or Tokyo where it might get cold more often?
And the interesting thing about district heating is it can also be used in the reverse as a cooling system. In Sweden, they will draw cold water from the lakes and rivers to help cool homes in the summer or when it gets really hot. And it is as simple as turning a valve and letting the cold water into the pipe. It almost doesn't require almost any power or any heat. Anything is required. And then in those warmer months, the heat is almost entirely provided by recycled heat from houses, or like people taking showers, doing their laundry, running baths, industrial heat waste. That's almost all what powers the heat system during those hot months. So I
Yeah.
think San Diego could benefit from a district heating system, but again, it's expensive and you'd have to build a lot of infrastructure for it.
Yeah. And so when you think about it, I mean, we use heating and cooling systems every day, no matter if we use it less than countries like Sweden would, because it is generally more cold. We still use heating for washing dishes, washing clothes, um, everything above. So it would definitely impact and help reduce CO2 emissions, maybe not to the degree that it does in Sweden, but it would still be a huge help. And that is our presentation.
Yep. All we have left is those references.
Yeah.